Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, warshippers of all ages, welcome to YouTube. My name is SeaRaptor, and today we're continuing our first look series at the upcoming American hybrid battleship branch by having a look at Tier 9's USS Delaware. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, in our never-ending quest to ensure that every American state is represented by a battleship in World of Warships, we are over to Delaware. Now, Delaware is, well, as you would maybe sort of expect, Delaware is very much based on an Iowa hull. Just like Nebraska down at Tier 8 was based on a North Carolina hull, when you look, you can see that taper towards the bow we talked about, much more pronounced. And again, when we look at the armor scheme, you'll see more of the similarities. So if you're used to driving in Iowa, you could probably get a pretty good sense of how this ship is going to handle and how her guns are going to perform because, yep, short version is these are Iowa guns. All right, but let's look around here. Let's have a quick peek and see what we've got going on, especially when we need to compare her to her contemporaries, because Tier 9 is a pretty busy place for battleships. And she has another battleship, another American hybrid battleship here at Tier 9 we can also do a little comparison to. So let's start things off here looking at her health pool, 80,800 HP. This is quite healthy. Now, again, she's not best in tier. Musashi still claims that. This is still Tier 9, so that's not surprising. But it does put her ahead of almost all the other American tech tree battleships, and only just behind Kearsarge, who is the healthiest American battleship here at Tier 9. She's still behind ships like Sovietsky Soyuz over in the Russian tree and Friedrich Gross over in the German tree, but this is quite a solid little health pool. Nothing to complain about here. 25% torpedo protection is, hey, the same as an Iowa class hull. So again, not all that surprising. Maneuverability and concealment. We'll go look at armor layout in just a moment. Maneuverability and concealment. Let's continue talking about the similarities. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. There you have it, 33 knots, Iowa speed. All right, so like we talked about last video, the speed these American battleships could achieve is one of the only things that really allowed the designers to kind of contemplate some of these kinds of designs, certainly with these incredibly short flight decks. And you see here, the one on Delaware is even shorter than one we saw on Nebraska down at Tier 8. The flight deck on Nebraska went all the way to the stern. In fact, it hung over the stern such that these AA tubs under the stern could only shoot like maybe, from 45 degrees above the horizon or so because of the overhang. Here, the flight deck is significantly shorter. I've got a lot more open deck space, and as we get to the A department, you'll see that there has been a corresponding increase for a variety of reasons. But yeah, 33 knots, 920 on the turning circle. These are Iowa handling numbers. No big deal. 17.2 on the rudder shift is actually a little better than Iowa, but she's still a battleship. That's just the way it is. It's not going to be that exciting. Now, one area that she does differ from Iowa is detection. Iowa's detection on the surface of 15.7. Here you can see Delaware about a half kilometer less stealthy, 16.2 on the surface. Not surprising, really. Her superstructure probably should extend quite a bit higher above the waterline. That would make her a little more detectable. So she's about a half kilometer less stealthy than Iowa. And that 14.8 aerial detection, that really hurts. That really hurts. This is the least stealthy Tier 9 battleship from the air. Like, by a huge margin. By like a kilometer and change. The Russians, that's Soyuz and Sovietsky Soyuz and Sovietsky Rossiya, are like 13.5. And this one is about a kilometer and a half beyond that. I sometimes wonder if this ship is going to survive testing with this number. We'll see. Kearsarge, by the way, the American premium hybrid battleship in this tier, 14 kilometers on the surface. I'm sorry, on the aerial detection. So she also has very, very high aerial detection. So this is probably by design, but she's got to keep that in mind because, yeah, that's something you got to work. That's something you got to deal with. Armor layout, well, again, like I mentioned earlier, if you're used to an Iowa-class hull, this is going to look very familiar. There is her Citadel, quite well protected, quite low in the water, so that's lovely to see. Again, these areas that stick up above the ship are considered her casemate armor, right? Yeah. So this is not considered Citadel armor. And then, of course, you've got all this superstructure. Now, one other thing that she does, I will say better. One other area that she differs in a good way from Nebraska down at Tier 8 is her deck armor. Her foredeck and her stern deck, these are 32 millimeters. But her flight deck and her midships deck here around the turrets is all 38 millimeters. That's going to make her a little more resistant to most typical heavy cruiser HE spam. The Germans, of course, so if you come across a Rune or a Hipper or a Hindenburg, or Clausewitz, because you can see a Clausewitz with this matchmaking now, they will pin this deck with their HE. But the Japanese, Ibuki, Zhao, those kinds of ships will not necessarily. Now, the high-tier Brits will, just because their guns get higher caliber. Same with the French. But like a Tier 8 heavy cruiser, a Baltimore's HE will not pin this. So, anyways, a little bit of a buff there in survivability. So she's got more health, and she's a little more resistant to full HE pin here through the midships area. All right, so let's go have a look at the main battery. If you remember, Nebraska, down at Tier 8, mounted only the two triple-barreled turrets forward in an AB configuration, right? Delaware expands upon that by adding a double-barreled turret back here at the stern of the ship. So she does have a couple more barrels, and she moves up in the world a bit. These are no longer the 45 caliber barrels of USS North Carolina. These are the 50 caliber barrels of USS Iowa. So you see there, 30-second reload, 45-second turret traverse. Those are identical to Iowa. 276 dispersion is, well, let's run the number. I got to give you both numbers here. So 21.6 kilometer range is less than Iowa. Iowa's range is a touch over 23 kilometers. But Iowa's dispersion ellipse is a little better than this. The benefit is that both of these ships have the same sigma. They're both looking at a 1.9 sigma. So you're using, if you give a full broadside, is one shell less than Iowa. The dispersion ellipse is a little worse, but the consistency of the shells within that dispersion ellipse is the same, is just as good as Iowa. So the main battery should feel pretty good if you're used to firing Iowa's guns and you like Iowa's guns. You can see there the AP shells have about a 60 meter per second higher velocity than we saw down at Nebraska at Tier 8, which means that the shells that you fire don't have nearly that same, we're talking about when you fire the North Carolina, Kansas, or Nebraska guns, those shells take a very long time to come down on the opposing end. Iowa's guns are better at that. Those shells come down, they arc. Once they hit the top of that arc, they fall a little faster. So you have to lead the target a little less. But if you want to get some practice with these guns, same guns that you're going to find on Iowa. No big deal. Let's see. What else have we got going on? Secondaries. Again, we're mounting 5 secondary turrets. 5 the American 5-inch 38s. I should say 5 each side. 3 here forward of the superstructure, and then 2 aft. So the exact same secondary arrangement we had on Nebraska. 5 on each side of the ship, 3 forward, 2 aft. On a 7-kilometer range, and then so you can bump that out to probably, 9 and change or so on the secondary range. Now, I don't know about a secondary build on this ship. I don't know that I would do it, but I have seen some people, and I'm looking at you, Mr. Deacon, fellow streamer here on NA, who likes to play secondary Kearsarge, which I think is a little crazy. I don't know that I'd recommend that here on Delaware, but if it tickles your fancy, hey, you do you. So if you like Iowa's guns, you're going to find a lot to like in Delaware's guns, in my mind. Let's have a look at AA. So we'll talk about her A, and then we'll go back and look at the airstrike, or the planes on the deck. Now, AA was one of Nebraska's weaknesses, in my opinion, but they really do a good job of shoring that up here in Delaware's design. For starters, I've got a lot more flak. I've got 8 puffs here, out to 5.8 kilometers. That's the same as Iowa, and my outer bubble is basically just as good as Iowa's here, 175 DPS. So the same outer bubble, same flak potential, and of course Iowa's A is quite solid. Delaware's middle ring, though, is where things get really, really interesting. If you recall, Nebraska's middle AA aura was not that good. She had the 40 millimeter Bofors, but there wasn't a lot of flat deck area for the designers to find places to stick them on. Delaware has 2 things going for her. For one, she has more deck area. You can see here they've opened up significant portions of the stern, and you can see some of these AA tubs back here. But also, her mid-range aura is no longer handled by the 40mm Bofors. It's handled by the American 76.2 millimeter guns. So these are the American 3-inch guns that make that mid-range aura so punishing on ships like Worcester. And these guns go out to 4 kilometers. So her mid-range aura, you see there, out to 4 kilometers, 469 DPS. Now, that is not best in tier, because there's a lot of Tier 8, Tier 9 battleships that have really good mid-range auras. But only a handful of them go out to 4 kilometers. And none of them, well, I won't say none of them, hang on a minute. I don't believe any of them go out to 4 kilometers with this kind of DPS. Let me I'm sorry, I had the spreadsheet filtered wrong. Yes, actually, okay. So no other Tier 9 battleship, let me back up a bit. No other Tier 9 battleship has a mid-range aura that goes out this far. And certainly none of them have one that goes out this far with this much DPS in it. So this is nice. This is a nice little buff that makes Delaware a little more resilient. And that's good. She is going to see Tier 9 carriers, and Madre de Dios, she's also going to see Tier 11 carriers. She's also going to see super carriers. As a result, her short range aura is not nearly as good. You can see there 1 to 75 DPS is, well, that's pretty bad. But honestly, it feels okay in the balance because they've sunk so much into her mid-range aura that her short-range aura is, well, it's not worse than tier, but it's definitely in the bottom 5 ships of Tier 9 battleships. So the mid-range aura is where the punch is here, and that's nice. I think that's a really solid choice because especially on the back of these guns, oh, so good. Let's talk about the planes. This is where this ship does some really strange things. If you'll recall, the Tier 10 American aircraft carrier, USS Midway, uses the BTD Destroyer, the Douglas BTD Destroyer, for her dive bombers up at Tier 10. Now, the BTD was never really produced in any serious quantity. I think a couple of dozen were built and in service at the end of the Second World War. And Douglas, very shortly thereafter, discontinued the plane. However, they used it as the jump-off to create the next generation of kind of American naval aircraft, naval aviation heavy bombers, which is this plane, the Douglas 81 SkyRaider. Now, the SkyRaider saw a significant amount of service in both Korea and all the way into Vietnam in both the American military and a variety of other militaries. In fact, there were SkyRaiders in service all the way into the 1980s, depending on which country you're talking about. So it's interesting to me that the Tier 9 American hybrid battleship is mounting a plane that is essentially the next generation later than the plane that is being mounted by the Tier 10 American hybrid battleship, which is mounting the BTD Destroyer. And we'll talk about that when we get to USS Louisiana in a couple of days. Very strange to me. So what does that mean for you as a player? Well, it means that these planes are a little harder to kill, ironically. These SkyRaiders have more health than the BTD Destroyer does up at Tier 10, the planes that Louisiana mounts. Now, Louisiana's squadron is bigger. She mounts 6 planes instead of the 5 here you're seeing in Delaware. So from a squadron health perspective, Louisiana still comes up on top. But from an individual plane perspective, Delaware has the beefiest planes. You see they're 2,600 health apiece. Really nice to see, I think. Now, offensively, these bombs are identical to the ones you're finding down at Tier 8. So this is the same potential damage out of the bomb strike you're going to get at Tier 8, Nebraska, one step below. So you 5 planes, 2 bombs each, the exact same bomb. 7,300 alpha damage, 42 millimeters of penetration, 46% fire chance. So all the caveats that we talked about with Nebraska down at Tier 8 still apply to the bombers here on Delaware. You've got to pick your targets correctly, right? Don't go picking on picking on a Yamato or a Kremlin or something. These bombs will shatter. You want to pick on a British battleship, a French battleship, a destroyer. That'd be a really good target if you can land some. Potentially a good heavy cruiser. Most heavy cruisers won't have deck armor to repel 42 millimeters of penetration, etc., etc. So if you pick on the right target, these will be very, very effective things to add to your arsenal. So yeah, kind of really interesting in my mind. And I think it's really weird that they chose the SkyRaider here for Tier 9. It would have made a little more sense for them to use the BTD Destroyer here at Tier 9 and then use the SkyRaiders at Tier 10, but that's not what they did. So, a little curious. Let's go look at the consumables. I think it's the same consumable setup as before. Yeah, same thing. So you're getting damage control here, of course, 4 heals and a fighter plane. One thing we didn't talk about at Nebraska, but the stock planes are the SBC-2 Helldivers that you had down at Tier 8. So the fully buffed planes here, of course, are the 81 SkyRaiders. So you do have to make that jump. So stock-wise, you get the same planes that you had at Tier 8, and then you've got the buffed ones here. So there is our first look at Tier 9 American hybrid battleship USS Delaware. I like the potential of this ship way better than Nebraska. Nebraska feels a little gimp to me. You give up a whole lot of barrels for an airstrike that is not bad, especially if you're top tier. That airstrike down on Nebraska is going to be really amazing. But if you're bottom tier, you're going to wish you had more barrels, right? The give up, the trade here on Delaware is less extreme, right? I'm only giving up 1 barrel. I'm getting more health. I'm more detectable. But in exchange, I have a really solid airstrike that I can use against certain targets. And I think you're going to have an even more difficult time balancing that armament swap of the planes and the main battery on this ship, because the main battery is so good compared to the main battery down at Tier 8, which is perhaps not quite as solid as this one. Anyway, guys, there's our first look at Delaware. Hope you enjoyed that. Wash your hands, be safe, and we'll see you back here in a couple days where we'll talk about Tier 10 USS Louisiana. Take care.